Section 4 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. Beacon Lights of History, Volume 1, The Old Pagan Civilizations, by John Lord. Religions of India, Part 2. Under these circumstances, Buddhism arose as a protest against Brahmanism. But it was rather an ethical than a religious movement. It was an attempt to remove misery from the world, and to elevate ordinary life by a reform of morals. It was effected by a prince who goes by the name of Buddha, the Enlightened, who was supposed by his later followers to be an incarnation of Deity, miraculously conceived, and sent into the world to save men. He was nearly contemporary with Confucius, although the Buddhistic doctrines were not introduced into China until about 200 years before the Christian era. He is supposed to have belonged to a warlike tribe called Sakyas, of great reputed virtue, engaged in agricultural pursuits, who had entered northern India and made a permanent settlement several hundred years before. The name by which the reformer is generally known is Gautama, borrowed by the Sakyas after their settlement in India from one of the ancient Vedic bard families. The fountain of our knowledge of Sakya Buddha is from a life of him by Asvaghosha, in the 1st century of our era, and this life is again founded on a legendary history, not framed after any Indian model, but worked out among the nations in the north of India. The life of Buddha by Asvaghosha is a poetical romance of nearly 10,000 lines. It relates the miraculous conception of the Indian sage by the descent of a spirit on his mother, Maya, a woman of great purity of mind. The child was called Siddhartha, or the perfection of all things. His father ruled a considerable territory, and was careful to conceal from the boy, as he grew up, all knowledge of the wickedness and misery of the world. He was therefore carefully educated within the walls of the palace, and surrounded with every luxury, but not allowed even to walk or drive in the royal gardens for fear he might see misery and sorrow. A beautiful girl was given to him in marriage, full of dignity and grace, with whom he lived in supreme happiness. At length, as his mind developed and his curiosity increased to see and know things and people beyond the narrow circle to which he was confined, he obtained permission to see the gardens which surrounded the palace. His father took care to remove anything in his way which could suggest misery or sorrow. But a deva, or angel, assumed the form of an aged man and stood beside his path, apparently struggling for life, weak and oppressed. This was a new sight to the prince, who inquired of his charioteer what kind of man it was. Forced to reply, the charioteer told him that this infirm old man had once been young, sportive, beautiful, and full of every enjoyment. On hearing this, the prince sank into profound meditation, and returned to the palace sad and reflective, for he had learned that the common lot of man is sad, that no matter how beautiful, strong, and sportive a boy is, the time will come, in the course of nature, when this boy will be wrinkled, infirm, and helpless. He became so miserable and dejected on this discovery that his father, to divert his mind, arranged other excursions for him; but on each occasion a deva contrived to appear before him in the form of some disease or misery. At last he saw a dead man carried to his grave, which still more deeply agitated him, for he had not known that this calamity was the common lot of all men. The same painful impression was made on him by the death of animals, and by the hard labors and privations of poor people. The more he saw of life as it was, the more he was overcome by the sight of sorrow and hardship on every side. He became aware that youth, vigor, and strength of life in the end fulfilled the law of ultimate destruction. While meditating on this sad reality beneath a flowering jambu tree, where he was seated in the profoundest contemplation, a deva, transformed into a religious ascetic, came to him and said, "I am a shaman, depressed and sad at the thought of age, disease, and death. I have left my home to seek some way of rescue, yet everywhere I find these evils. All things hasten to decay. Therefore I seek that happiness which is only to be found in that which never perishes, that never knew a beginning, that looks with equal mind on enemy and friend, that heeds not wealth nor beauty; the happiness to be found in solitude, in some dell free from molestation, all thought about the world destroyed." This embodies the soul of Buddhism, its elemental principle, to escape from a world of misery and death. to hide oneself in contemplation in some lonely spot, where indifference to passing events is gradually acquired, where life becomes one grand negation, and where the thoughts are fixed on what is eternal and imperishable, instead of on the mortal and transient. The prince, who was now about 30 years of age, after this interview with the supposed ascetic, firmly resolved himself to become a hermit, and thus attain to a higher life, and rise above the misery which he saw around him on every hand. So he clandestinely and secretly escapes from his guarded palace, lays aside his princely habits and ornaments, dismisses all attendants and even his horse, seeks the companionship of Brahmans, and learns all their penances and tortures. Finding a patient trial of this of no avail for his purpose, he leaves the Brahmans and repairs to a quiet spot by the banks of a river, and for 6 years practices the most severe fasting and profound meditation. This was the form which piety had assumed in India from time immemorial under the guidance of the Brahmans, for Siddhartha as yet is not the enlightened; he is only an inquirer after that saving knowledge which will open the door of a divine felicity, and raise him above a world of disease and death. Siddhartha's rigorous austerities, however, do not open this door of saving truth. His body is wasted, and his strength fails; he is near unto death. The conviction fastens on his lofty and inquiring mind that to arrive at the end he seeks he must enter by some other door than that of painful and useless austerities, and hence that the teachings of the Brahmans are fundamentally wrong. He discovers that no amount of austerities will extinguish desire, or produce ecstatic contemplation. In consequence of these reflections a great change comes over him, which is the turning point of his history. He resolves to quit his self-inflicted torments as of no avail. He meets a shepherd's daughter, who offers him food out of compassion for his emaciated and miserable condition. The rich rice milk, sweet and perfumed, restores his strength. He renounces asceticism, and wanders to a spot more congenial to his changed views and condition. Siddhartha's full enlightenment, however, has not yet come. Under the shade of the Bodhi tree he devotes himself again to religious contemplation, and falls into rapt ecstasies. He remains a while in peaceful quiet. The morning sunbeams, the dispersing mists, and lovely flowers seem to pay tribute to him. He passes through successive stages of ecstasy, and suddenly upon his opened mind bursts the knowledge of his previous births in different forms, of the causes of rebirth, ignorance, the root of evil, and unsatisfied desires, and of the way to extinguish desires by right thinking, speaking, and living, not by outward observance of forms and ceremonies. He is emancipated from the thraldom of those austerities which have formed the basis of religious life for generations unknown, and he resolves to teach. Buddha travels slowly to the sacred city of Benares, converting by the way even Brahmans themselves. He claims to have reached perfect wisdom. He is followed by disciples, for there was something attractive and extraordinary about him. His person was beautiful and commanding. While he shows that painful austerities will not produce wisdom, he also teaches that wisdom is not reached by self-indulgence, that there is a middle path between penance and pleasures, even temperance, the use, but not abuse, of the good things of earth. In his first sermon he declares that sorrow is in self; therefore to get rid of sorrow is to get rid of self. The means to this end is to forget self in deeds of mercy and kindness to others, to crucify demoralizing desires, to live in the realm of devout contemplation. The active life of Buddha now begins, and for 50 years he travels from place to place as a teacher, gathers around him disciples, frames rules for his society, and brings within his community both the rich and the poor. He even allows women to enter it. He thus matures his system, which is destined to be embraced by so large a part of the human race, and finally dies at the age of 80, surrounded by reverential followers, who see in him an incarnation of the Deity. Thus Buddha devoted his life to the welfare of men, moved by an exceeding tenderness and pity for the objects of misery which he beheld on every side. He attempted to point out a higher life, by which sorrow would be forgotten. He could not prevent sorrow culminating in old age, disease, and death, but he hoped to make men ignore their miseries and thus rise above them to a beatific state of devout contemplation and the practice of virtues, for which he laid down certain rules and regulations. It is astonishing how the new doctrines spread, from India to China, from China to Japan and Ceylon, until Eastern Asia was filled with pagodas, temples, and monasteries to attest his influence. Some 85,000 existed in China alone. Buddha probably had as many converts in China as Confucius himself. The Buddhists from time to time were subjected to great persecution from the emperors of China, in which their sacred books were destroyed; and in India the Brahmans at last regained their power, and expelled Buddhism from the country. In the year 845 A.D., 260,000 monks and nuns were made to return to secular life in China, being regarded as mere drones, lazy, useless members of the community. But the policy of persecution was reversed by succeeding emperors. In the 13th century there were in China nearly 50,000 Buddhist temples and 213,000 monks, and these represented but a fraction of the professed adherents of the religion. Under the present dynasty the Buddhists are proscribed, but still they flourish. Now, what has given to the religion of Buddha such an extraordinary attraction for the people of Eastern Asia? Buddhism has a twofold aspect, practical and speculative. In its most definite form it was a moral and philanthropic movement, the reaction against Brahmanism, which had no humanity, and which was as repulsive and oppressive as Roman Catholicism was when loaded down with ritualism and sacerdotal rites, when Europe was governed by priests, when churches were damp, gloomy crypts, before the tall cathedrals arose in their artistic beauty. From a religious and philosophical point of view, Buddhism at first did not materially differ from Brahmanism. The same dreamy pietism, the same belief in the transmigration of souls, the same pantheistic ideas of God and nature, the same desire for rest and final absorption in the divine essence characterized both. In both there was a certain principle of faith, which was a feeling of reverence rather than the recognition of the unity and personality and providence of God. The prayer of the Buddhist was a yearning for deliverance from sorrow, a hope of final rest; but this was not to be attained until desires and passions were utterly suppressed in the soul, which could be effected only by prayer, devout meditations, and a rigorous self discipline. In order to be purified and fitted for Nirvana, the soul, it was supposed, must pass through successive stages of existence in mortal forms, without conscious recollection, innumerable births and deaths, with sorrow and disease; and the final state of supreme blessedness, the ending of the long and weary transmigration, would be attained only with the extinction of all desires, even the instinctive desire for existence. Buddha had no definite ideas of the deity, and the worship of a personal God is nowhere to be found in his teachings, which exposed him to the charge of atheism. He even supposed that gods were subject to death, and must return to other forms of life before they obtained final rest in Nirvana. Nirvana means that state which admits of neither birth nor death, where there is no sorrow or disease, an impassive state of existence, absorption in the spirit of the universe. In the Buddhist Catechism, Nirvana is defined as the total cessation of changes, a perfect rest, the absence of desire, illusion, and sorrow, the total obliteration of everything that goes to make up the physical man. This theory of rebirths, or transmigration of souls, is very strange and unnatural to our less imaginative and subtle Occidental minds. But to the speculative Orientals it is an attractive and reasonable belief. They make the spirit the immortal part of man, the soul being its emotional embodiment, its spiritual body, whose unsatisfied desires cause its birth and rebirth into the fleshly form of the physical body, a very brief and temporary incarnation. When by the progressive enlightenment of the spirit its longings and desires have been gradually conquered, it no longer needs or has embodiment either of soul or of body; so that, to quote Eliot Coues in Olcott's Buddhist Catechism, a spirit in a state of conscious formlessness, subject to no further modification by embodiment, yet in full knowledge of its experiences, during its various incarnations, is nirvanic. Buddhism, however, viewed in any aspect, must be regarded as a gloomy religion. It is hard enough to crucify all natural desires and lead a life of self-abnegation; but for the spirit, in order to be purified, to be obliged to enter into body after body, each subject to disease, misery, and death, and then after a long series of migrations, to be virtually annihilated as the highest consummation of happiness, gives one but a poor conception of the efforts of the proudest unaided intellect to arrive at a knowledge of God and immortal bliss. It would thus seem that the true idea of God, or even that of immortality, is not an innate conception revealed by consciousness; for why should good and intellectual men, trained to study and reflection all their lives, gain no clearer or more inspiring notions of the Being of infinite love and power, or of the happiness which he is able and willing to impart? What a feeble conception of God as a being without the oversight of the worlds that he created, without volition or purpose or benevolence, or anything corresponding to our notion of personality. What a poor conception of supernal bliss, without love or action or thought or holy companionship! Only rest, unthinking repose, and absence from disease, misery, and death, a state of endless impassiveness. What is Nirvana but an escape from death and deliverance from mortal desires, where there are neither ideas nor the absence of ideas, no changes or hopes or fears, it is true, but also no joy, no aspiration, no growth, no life; a state of nonentity, where even consciousness is practically extinguished, and individuality merged into absolute stillness and a dreamless rest? What a poor reward for ages of struggle and the final achievement of exalted virtue! But if Buddhism failed to arrive at what we believe to be a true knowledge of God and the destiny of the soul, the forgiveness and remission, or doing away of sin, and a joyful and active immortality, all which I take to be revelations rather than intuitions, yet there were some great certitudes in its teachings which did appeal to consciousness, certitudes recognized by the noblest teachers of all ages and nations. These were such realities as truthfulness, sincerity, purity, justice, mercy, benevolence, unselfishness, love. The human mind arrives at ethical truths, even when all speculation about God and immortality has failed. The idea of God may be lost, but not that of moral obligation, the mutual social duties of mankind. There is a sense of duty even among savages; in the lowest civilization there is true admiration of virtue. No sage that I ever read of enjoined mortality. No ignorance can prevent the sense of shame, of honor, or of duty. Everybody detests a liar and despises a thief. Thou shalt not bear false witness; thou shalt not commit adultery; thou shalt not kill. These are laws written in the human consciousness as well as in the code of Moses. Obedience and respect to parents are instincts as well as obligations. Hence the Prince Siddhartha, as soon as he had found the wisdom of inward motive and the folly of outward rite, shook off the yoke of the priests, and denounced caste and austerities and penances and sacrifices as of no avail in securing the welfare and peace of the soul or the favor of deity. In all this he showed an enlightened mind, governed by wisdom and truth, and even a bold and original genius, like Abraham when he disowned the gods of his fathers. Having thus himself gained the security of the heights, Buddha longed to help others up, and turned his attention to the moral instruction of the people of India. He was emphatically a missionary of ethics, an apostle of righteousness, a reformer of abuses, as well as a tender and compassionate man, moved to tears in view of human sorrows and sufferings. He gave up metaphysical speculations for practical philanthropy. He wandered from city to city and village to village, to relieve misery and teach duties rather than theological philosophies. He did not know that God is love, but he did know that peace and rest are the result of virtuous thoughts and acts. "Let us then," said he, "live happily, not hating those who hate us, free from greed among the greedy. Proclaim mercy freely to all men; it is as large as the spaces of heaven. Whoever loves will feel the longing to save not himself alone, but all others." He compares himself to a father who rescues his children from a burning house, to a physician who cures the blind. He teaches the equality of the sexes as well as the injustice of castes. He enjoins kindness to servants and emancipation of slaves. "As a mother, as long as she lives, watches over her child, so among all beings," said Gautama, "let boundless goodwill prevail. Overcome evil with good, the avaricious with generosity, the false with truth. Never forget thy own duty for the sake of another's. If a man speaks or acts with evil thoughts, pain follows, as the wheel, the foot of him who draws the carriage. He who lives seeking pleasure and uncontrolled, the tempter will overcome. The true sage dwells on earth, as the bee gathers sweetness with his mouth and wings. One may conquer 1,000 men in battle, but he who conquers himself alone is the greatest victor. Let no man think lightly of sin, saying in his heart, it cannot overtake me. Let a man make himself what he preaches to others. He who holds back rising anger as one might a rolling chariot, him indeed I call a driver. Others may hold the reins. A man who foolishly does me wrong, I will return to him the protection of my ungrudging love. The more evil comes from him, the more good shall go from me." These are some of the sayings of the Indian reformer, which I quote from extracts of his writings as translated by Sanskrit scholars. Some of these sayings rise to a height of moral beauty surpassed only by the precepts of the great teacher, whom many are too fond of likening to Buddha himself. The religion of Buddha is founded on a correct and virtuous life, as the only way to avoid sorrow and reach nirvana. Its essence, theologically, is quietism, without firm belief in anything reached by metaphysic speculation, yet morally and practically it inculcates ennobling active duties. Among the rules that Buddha laid down for his disciples were to keep the body pure, not to enter upon affairs of trade, to have no lands and cattle, or houses, or money, to abhor all hypocrisy and dissimulation, to be kind to everything that lives, never to take the life of any living being, to control the passions, to eat food only to satisfy hunger, not to feel resentment from injuries, to be patient and forgiving, to avoid covetousness, and never to tire of self-reflection. His fundamental principles are purity of mind, chastity of life, truthfulness, temperance, abstention from the wanton destruction of animal life, from vain pleasures, from envy, hatred, and malice. He does not enjoin sacrifices, for he knows no god to whom they can be offered; but he proclaimed the brotherhood of man, if he did not reveal the fatherhood of God. He insisted on the natural equality of all men, thus giving to caste a mortal wound, which offended the Brahmans and finally led to the expulsion of his followers from India. He protested against all absolute authority, even that of the Vedas. Nor did he claim, any more than Confucius, originality of doctrines, only the revival of forgotten or neglected truths. He taught that nirvana was not attained by Brahmanical rites, but by individual virtues, and that punishment is the inevitable result of evil deeds by the inexorable law of cause and effect. Buddhism is essentially rationalistic and ethical, while Brahmanism is a pantheistic tendency to polytheism, and ritualistic even to the most offensive sacerdotalism. The Brahmin reminds me of a Dunstan, the Buddhist of a Benedict; the former of the gloomy spiritual despotism of the Middle Ages, the latter of self-denying monasticism in its best ages. The Brahmin is like Thomas Aquinas with his dogmas and metaphysics; the Buddhist is more like a medieval freethinker, stigmatized as an atheist. The Brahmin was so absorbed with his theological speculation that he took no account of the sufferings of humanity. The Buddhist was so absorbed with the miseries of man that the greatest blessing seemed to be entire and endless rest, the cessation of existence itself, since existence brought desire, desire sin, and sin misery. As a religion, Buddhism is an absurdity. In fact, it is no religion at all, only a system of moral philosophy. Its weak points, practically, are the abuse of philanthropy, its system of organized idleness and mendicancy, the indifference to thrift and industry, the multiplication of lazy fraternities and useless retreats, reminding us of monastic institutions in the days of Chaucer and Luther. The Buddhist priest is a mendicant and a pauper, clothed in rags, begging his living from door to door, in which he sees no disgrace, and no impropriety. Buddhism failed to ennoble the daily occupations of life, and produced drones and idlers and religious vagabonds. In its corruption it lent itself to idolatry, for the Buddhist temples are filled with hideous images of all sorts of repulsive deities, although Buddha himself did not hold to idol worship any more than to the belief in a personal God. Buddhism, says the author of its accepted catechism, teaches goodness without a God, existence without a soul, immortality without life, happiness without a heaven, salvation without a Savior, redemption without a Redeemer, and worship without rites. The failure of Buddhism, both as a philosophy and a religion, is a confirmation of the great historical fact that in the ancient pagan world no efforts of reason enabled man unaided to arrive at a true, that is, a helpful and practically elevating, knowledge of Deity. Even Buddha, one of the most gifted and excellent of all the sages who have enlightened the world, despaired of solving the great mysteries of existence, and turned his attention to those practical duties of life which seemed to promise a way of escaping its miseries. He appealed to human consciousness, but lacking the inspiration and aid which come from a sense of personal divine influence, Buddhism has failed, on the large scale, to raise its votaries to higher planes of ethical accomplishment. And hence the necessity of that new revelation which Jesus declared amid the moral ruins of a crumbling world, by which alone can the debasing superstitions of India and the godless materialism of China be replaced with a vital spirituality, even as the elaborate mythology of Greece and Rome gave way before the fervent earnestness of Christian apostles and martyrs. It does not belong to my subject to present the condition of Buddhism as it exists today in Tibet, in Siam, in China, in Japan, in Burma, in Ceylon, and in various other Eastern countries. It spread by reason of its sympathy with the poor and miserable, by virtue of its being a great system of philanthropy and morals which appealed to the consciousness of the lower classes. Though a proselytizing religion, it was never a persecuting one, and it is still distinguished in all its corruption for its toleration. Authorities. The chief authorities that I would recommend for this chapter are Max Müller's History of Ancient Sanskrit Literature, Rev. S. Seal's Buddhism in China, Buddhism by T.W. Rhys Davids, Monier Williams' Saktunala, I. Muir's Sanskrit Texts, Burnouf's Essay sur la Veda, Sir William Jones's Works, Colebrook's Miscellaneous Essays, Joseph Muller's Religious Aspects of Hindu Philosophy, Manual of Buddhism by R. Spence Hardy, Dr. H. Clay Trumbull's The Blood Covenant, Orthodox Buddhist Catechism by H. S. Olcott, edited by Professor Elliott C. Coues. I have derived some instruction from Samuel Johnson's bulky and diffuse books, but more from James Freeman Clarke's 10 Great Religions and Rawlinson's Religions of the Ancient World. End of Section 4.